Tame. Well, let me tell you, this is an absolute delight for me to come back here. Dr. Park last night said that she wanted the Women's Studies program, Women and Gender Studies program, to feel like home for all the students. Well, it feels like home to me, and I just want to share with everyone that I've taught intellectual history and political science before I came to Georgetown, but this was my first experience teaching women's studies. And it's because of the quality of the students here, their enthusiasm, that I really thought this is a viable life for me. And since then I haven't looked back. So I really want to thank Georgetown students and my colleagues here for really helping chart a different direction for my life. You truly are incredible students, and I saw some of that last night, the love that you have for not only your teachers, but just a certain kind of the life of the mind, and a certain playfulness as well in the way you approach your work. So I salute you for that, and I congratulate and want to share the celebration of this program's birthday. So Rajini has given quite an extensive introduction to what I do, so I'm not going to repeat that. What I'm going to speak about today is really focused on my current work, and so what you will hear is somewhat tentative, and I welcome questions at the end that will push me a little bit further. So over the past decade that I've researched the sex trade, it's been increasingly clear to me that the figure of the child haunts its laws about prostitution. Whether we're looking at contexts of legalization or criminalization, laws are at pains to specify what constitutes a child. Laws on marriage and rape as well declare age limits below which sex is banned. Yet, laws on prostitution, rape, and marriage, and indeed child labor frequently differ on how they define or demarcate the boundary between childhood and adulthood. So when in the course of my work on the sex trade, I confronted these differences, they really raised questions for me about how childhood is constructed, and in particular how girlhood is constructed, since laws often focused on girls. My interest in girlhood has been intensified by the recent surge of campaigns focused on girls. Everywhere we look, development agencies, corporate charity campaigns, national legislators, and intergovernmental agencies, we see girls fetishized as targets of intervention. So you may be familiar with corporate campaigns such as Nike Foundation's Girl Effect, yes? Which calls for investing in girls and declares that the revolution will be led by a 12-year-old girl, and that adolescent girls are capable of raising the standard of living in the developing world. You're also probably familiar with the United Nations Foundation's Girl Up campaign and Plan International's Because I'm a Girl campaign, which are all not very far removed from the first example I gave, because they use the language of social capital to justify attention towards girls. Now, just this past week, when President Obama declared the US's leadership in fighting sex trafficking, his focus was specifically also on girls, noting that, quote, "Some girls sold off by poor families are no older than my own 2 daughters," unquote. Even the otherwise paralyzed US Senate passed the, quote, "International Protecting Girls by Preventing Child Marriage Act" at the end of 2010. So clearly there's something going on here. There's been a shift, right, towards girls as the focus. And it's important to note that it's not just girls of any age, but specifically adolescent girls who are the targets. Adolescence is presented as a phase where much can go wrong, when individuals need protection because much is at stake. And an assumption here is that adolescent girls are on an inescapable path to reproductive womanhood, and that investing in them, especially in their education, will delay and limit their childbearing, and also improve the quality of their child rearing. The figure of the adolescent girl, I think, has now replaced the figure of the hard-working woman in NGO fundraising circles and in development discourses. And I taught the gender development course here for many years, and at that point I used to sort of throw my hands up in frustration when I encountered this very sort of oversimplified understanding of the third world woman. And you're probably all familiar with those critiques. But I think what we need to pay attention to now is this figure of the adolescent girl that has displaced this figure of the hardworking third world woman. So after all, which donor can resist this combination of vulnerability and potential, right? So my work is primarily historical. My background is in international studies, but the methods I use and the sources I focus on are primarily from the past. And my project right now tries to unearth the history of this figure of the adolescent unmarried girl, which, it's worth noting, is a fairly recent configuration. In the specific context of Western India, given the prevalence of early marriage, it's clear that many girls transitioned into reproductive womanhood as early as 12 years of age through the early 20th century. In the articles of the Women's Magazines 3 that I'm digitally archiving right now, material from the 1930s and 40s tells me that there are much more complex notions of the distinctions between girlhood and adulthood at work there. The fights are about allowing girls to continue schooling after getting married. I see letters written to the editor by those who are married at 11 and 12 calling for divorce rights. Right? So it's a whole different sort of picture. The concept of adolescence itself, which extends the span of girlhood beyond puberty for several years, has not yet taken root. In fact, it took root much more gradually. I'm interested in tracking how the valence of adolescence has shifted over the course of the 20th century from being considered a peak period in one's life, where beauty and romantic possibility are at their height, to being a closely supervised and freighted life cycle stage. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Afsani Najmabadi's book on modern Iran, titled Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards. It's a fantastic book. It tracks how the 19th century figure of adolescent male beauty in Iran, called the Amrad, has been erased from 20th century gender positionalities. I'm looking at a different context, but like her, my goal is to think about key shifts in the 20th century, with attention to how transnational currents of lawmaking and discourses of modernity shape these configurations. How is it that a life cycle stage seen as ripe with sexual possibility came to be bounded, protected, and indeed, one could say securitized or secured? I hesitate to use the word securitized given what's going on in the economy right now, but still, for those of you who are sort of familiar with that vein of scholarship, you might sort of forgive me this transference of the term. So the question of how life stages are imagined and demarcated has engaged surprisingly few South Asianists or South Asian historians. So let me tell you a little bit more about the area I work in. I'm really surprised because within South Asian religious traditions, there are alternative understandings of life stages. Some of you may be familiar with Hindu scriptural understandings that delineate a four-stage view of life, graduating from childhood to a period of study, to then becoming a householder, to then moving on to celibacy and renunciation. There are no age markers, but there are sort of phases and activities that are held as central to different periods of life. Interestingly, there are differences in various scriptures, and that's what I'm really also keen on exploring. Differences in scriptures between when marriage is actually advocated for girls. The earliest text, the Rig Veda, for instance, points to marriage as occurring between fully developed adults, but later Smritis argue that marriage has to occur for girls before puberty. And then you have Ayurvedic physicians who say that a child conceived by girls who are not of age will result in children who are malformed. So these sort of differences in scriptural positions are important to explore in a context where people assume that traditions are univocal, are very uniform. So these sorts of contradictions are important for me. But quite apart also from the scriptural positions, there have been interesting critiques of linear and stagist understandings of time itself in South Asian historiography. And I'm thinking here of Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, which asks us to think about how pasts continue to animate the present and to guard against domesticating the past. So theorizing how life stages are conceived in South Asia is really long overdue. Now, the very concept of adolescence, as I indicated earlier, is fairly new in this context. It was inaugurated primarily by US psychologists in the 1920s who delinked puberty, which was hitherto a crucial age marker, who delinked it from readiness for marriage. Their argument was that physiological maturity did not signal intellectual and emotional maturity. And so they argued for stretching out the transition over several years and defined this period as being one of emotional instability. And here they drew on strains of German romanticism in sort of thinking about this life phase as marked by storm and stress. The category of adolescence traveled to Indian medical contexts and took a while to get sedimented in popular culture and consciousness. And indeed, the very possibility of adolescence being available to girls rested on the shift towards later marriages, which took place only in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, I should clarify at this point that while historicizing the meanings of adolescence, I'm also aware of the potential uses of this term. And Jack Halbestrand has actually described this political value very well in an article theorizing queer youth subcultures, showing how claiming a long adolescence imagines futures outside conventional forward-moving narratives of birth, marriage, reproduction, and death. Many in this audience will also recognize how young feminist activists have taken up the term girl, in creative ways since the 1990s. Nevertheless, it's still important to recognize the standardization of age-based markers for defining the boundaries of girlhood is a fairly recent development, late 19th and early 20th century development. It's been possible only with the process of more rigorous registering of births. And to me, it's really interesting how over the course of the 20th century, we've arrived at something of a consensus that the age 18 marks a transition. How much time is it? I forgot to check when I started. 6 minutes, okay. So, I have focused quite a bit on intergovernmental contexts, so the League of Nations and the United Nations as settings where the boundaries of childhood were defined in important ways. Some of the earliest work on defining childhood was carried out in the context of anti-trafficking efforts. And the organizations that I just mentioned breathed life into the idea that the boundaries, age boundaries of girlhood could be clearly fixed. They compiled the differences between the age of consent for sexual activity in various countries, and then they tried to harmonize the age of consent. Although these organizations contributed to the formalization of these legal standards, the process itself was highly contested. So some of my recent work focuses on how imperial hierarchies played out in that process of legal wrangling. So for instance, in the 1920s and 30s, imperial powers such as France and Britain wanted to argue that their colonies should have a lower age of consent than the metropolitan centers. They fought to create something called a tropical exception, I'm quoting here, stating that age standards need to be lower in the colonies because menstruation and sexual maturation occurred earlier in those climates. So one article I recently wrote tracks the rise of climate-based theories of racial difference. Early sexual maturity itself was taken to be a sign of civilizational backwardness, and late menstruation was equated with modernity in many of these debates. So what these debates did was sort of replay a homology between notions of societal progress and individual development. Civilizational differences were read into these distinctions between the ages of consent in various countries. Postponing adulthood was presented as an indisputable marker of a society's advancement. So what I look at is how currents of scientific racism and what I call humanitarian racism informed efforts to harmonize age standards across countries. So how, for the rest of the century and indeed persisting today, you have an effect, this consensus remains. Societies that delay adulthood are, we assume, more advanced. Now, how does this work relate to feminist theory? A considerable body of scholarship on gender, empire, and nationalism demonstrates that matters related to sexuality have played a crucial role in articulating power hierarchies between groups. My work continues this line of thinking, asking how intergovernmental arenas served as sites for working out various imperial hierarchies. My work also relates to histories of biopolitics. States turn to delineating ages of consent because, not necessarily in the interest of girls, but because it could potentially affect birth rates and help states shape their demographic futures. In India, age standards were raised not necessarily because it would benefit girls, but because the imperative of controlling the quality and quantity of the population ruled. And what does all of this also mean for feminist activism? One thing that I'm troubled by is the role that early feminists have played in this process of delaying social adulthood. British activist Eleanor Rathbone, for instance, was a very prominent figure at League of Nations debates, and she proposed that states take on the goal of recording the age at which puberty occurred across their respective populations. And then she said we should compute an average to serve as the basis on which a universal law can be formulated. My reservations have to do with the fact that many of the laws that I've examined, in practice, as they unfolded, did not serve the interests of girls, and they were often much more about cementing parental control over girls' sexual practices. Was that a 2-minute mark? Okay. In the 20th century Indian context, where parents overwhelmingly arranged marriages, the age of consent was really about the age at which parents gave permission. And interestingly, parents pushed to have the age of consent for non-marital sex raised because it served as a safety valve. Girls who chose mates that the parents disapproved of could be declared victims of rape or abduction under these new sorts of formulations. So they were really recruiting the state to serve as a surrogate parent as the age of consent for marriage was being raised. And finally, when we look at the fact that feminists have been key figures in delaying social adulthood, I think it also says something about the ideal feminist subject whom we uphold, the ideal target of intervention. We prioritize innocence and those whose innocence must be preserved. But the question, I think, for feminist theory really is, why are we so attached to innocent subjects? Whether we're talking about targets of rescue from the sex trade, which my previous writing has been about, or rescue from marriage, which I'm more focused on now. How might we fashion a better feminism by rejecting our expectation of the innocence of those whom we help, and also, and importantly, acknowledging our own non-innocent histories? That's where I had initially stopped my talk, but I just want to add not just our non-innocent histories, but indeed our non-innocent present. You know, we're complicit in ignoring many problems today. We're not, I think, even coming to terms with our non-innocence, for instance, in ignoring the US drone attacks. We're so focused right now in the US on the elections and the way in which Republicans have sort of pushed the debates and controversies so far right that we're sort of not paying attention to the fact that feminists have been recruited in Islamophobic narratives that allow us to ignore what takes place in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And just this morning I was reading the Stanford NYU report that says that less than 2% of those who are killed in drone attacks are militants, and that large numbers of them are children. And more people have been killed than were killed in the 9/11 attacks. So I mean, I think this is a feminist issue. I think this is a children's rights issue by virtue of the fact that women live in fear because their households are being razed, with little warning. This is very much, I think, a feminist issue, and yet, I think there's a reason why we can't really frame it as such, and that's because we think, we have to always have pure origins, and we can't quite come to terms with the way in which feminist arguments have justified many of these military interventions. So, slightly veering off track in my ending, but I hope that these questions help start some conversations. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashwini. So next up we have Hagar Kotep, who is a recent fellow from Columbia University in the Humanities and is now transitioning to the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University in Israel. While her early work, specializing in feminist theory, early liberal philosophy, women's activism, and contemporary continental philosophy traced and analyzed the politicization of the body in first-wave liberal feminism, Dr. Hagar's recent research is set in a more contemporary context and focuses on the regime of movement employed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. It seeks to examine a new mode of subject formation, operating outside of normalizing regimes and underlying what we may call the paradigm of security. Essays from these two projects were published in journals such as Science, Theory, Culture, and Society, and Feminist Studies, among others. Dr. Kotep's forthcoming book, Movement and the Ordering of Freedom, A History of a Political Problem, will be published by Duke University Press. I present Dr. Kotep.
Thank you for this introduction. Thank you, Dr. Park, for inviting me here and for your very warm words. I'm still overwhelmed by the reception yesterday and the welcoming, and I hope that between this being overwhelmed and the fact that I'm recovering from a cold, I won't lose my voice as I speak. One of the main questions within I'm struggling at the moment is what happens to so many political movements, organizations, modes of activism that begin as oppositional movement and then get co-opted in different degrees and forms into the powers to which they seek to oppose. And partly I want to propose that we must take gender into account when trying to understand these processes of assimilation and co-optation, and I think this element is quite missing in the very wide literature that thinks about processes of co-optations and assimilations of humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations. And when I was invited here and when I learned I'm going to be at a panel next to Jack, I realized that a lot of what I do has to do with failure. And in trying to understand the failure of sustaining a certain political voice, and in trying to, or the failure to hold on to certain political successes. And so what I want to do today is to try to take more seriously the call to think really about failure. To think really about failure not as in registering it within particular sexual domain, but taking the analytical frameworks and sets of problems and insights we have from queer theory in order to think of the failures of political interventions, and in order to try to see these failures not as the end of a certain process, but as a productive power within political forms of intervention. So what I want to try to do now is to tell you a story about failure, and then try to rework this story to see if we can do something more with it. And this is the story of Tali Fahima, who is a young Jewish Israeli woman who used her body as a human shield in order to protect a leader of a Palestinian military group. And I'm going to tell you this story also in order to try to demonstrate that gender may be significant, as I said before, in trying to understand to understand the unintended or uncalculated, perhaps even uncalculable effects of political activism that is sometimes imagined as taking form outside the realm of gender, such as an anti-occupation agenda in my case. So before I start with the story, given what's going on in the last days in the news, I'm wondering how many of you need the basic background of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Okay, we have at least, I promised myself if there will be at least one hand in that audience, I will do this. Can you see this? So this is the most flat, outrageously short introduction to the conflict I can come up with. So please don't quote me on it. In 1967, which is, I have to say, somewhat an arbitrary point of beginning, but I will still begin with that, Israel, which before that used to be all of this area around here, occupied these two big chunks of land, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These two chunks of land and the Golan Heights here, which is not even marked here, I'm just lost. So these two chunks of land were never annexed to Israel. Israel has not deployed its own official rule on these territories. They are under military rules. And their inhabitants, the Palestinians, are not citizens of any country, but rather occupied people, population. This is not a leftist claim. It is a fact that even the state of Israel recognizes. So this was the situation until 1987, with the first Intifada, the first popular uprising of Palestinians, which slowly led to the Oslo Accord, which was supposed to end in a two-state solution between Israel, dividing this piece of land into two states, Israel and Palestine. This never happened, and in 2000, we have the second Intifada, the second uprising, which is much more violent from both sides than the first Intifada. It included many attacks of Palestinians in Israel and many massive military operations of Israel within the Palestinian territories, including, you talked about drones attacks, so including a huge, massive deployment of drone bombing on military leaders, organizations, and political leaders in Palestine. Israel does not distinguish between military and political Palestinian leaders. And this is where our story begins, with these kind of attacks. So in August 2003, Tali Fahima, who was a young Jewish Israeli woman who was never part of any institutional organization before, traveled for the first time to the Palestinian city of Jenin to meet with Zachariah Zveidi. Zveidi was the head of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, a Palestinian military organization that planned and executed several quite lethal suicide attacks within Israel, and was known in its persistent refusal of any form of ceasefire or negotiation with Israel. Although Israelis are not allowed to enter Palestinian cities, Fahima traveled to Jenin several times and was arrested and immediately released as she crossed one of the many checkpoints surrounding the city. So again, this is a bad map. It's bad because, as my history, it's very partial. But this is a map of some of the main checkpoints in the West Bank. I'm going to give you a somewhat better map, not of the city of Jenin because I don't have it currently, but of the city of Nablus, which is here. But the story is more or less the same around all Palestinian cities. This is the better map. And so you see here the variety of obstacles surrounding almost each and every Palestinian enclave and town. Jenin is also surrounded by such a variety of obstacles, and Fahima had to cross them in order to come and meet with Sveidi, and to cross them back in order to go to Israel. Since she belongs to the privileged, I don't even know how to call it, race, religion, nationality in Israel as a Jew, even though she was checked by this checkpoint, she was often let in, and even though she was stopped at them on her way back, she was often immediately released. These checkpoints are there to stop Palestinian movement, not to stop Israel movement. But after Zweidi escaped a targeted assassination attempt by Israel, Fahima publicly declared she will serve as his human shield. She moved to Jenin to live with his family, to live in his house, and arose turbulence in Israel. This time, on her way back from Jenin, she was arrested, jailed, and accused of treason and assisting the enemy in a time of war. Yet, although these were the formal charges, it seemed that they rested upon other allegations that were perceived as at least as severe, if not more. Fahima was accused in being Sveidi's lover, and the alleged affair between them became the focus of almost any media coverage of her story, including the more supportive among them, despite the fact that both her and Sveidi denied any sexual affair. So the formal betrayal of the homeland actually rested upon another assumed betrayal, a sexual betrayal, in the only legitimate sexual partner, Jewish Israeli men. And the fact that Fahima was often described at the same time as having a lesbian look suggests that the precise practice by which she transgressed this prescribed sexual norm was not that important. If you are curious about how lesbian looks like, this is Fahima, and this is Faye. So Fahima tried to counter these accusations by distilling from her action a pure political message and cleansing from it everything that is personal. Not only did she refuse to talk about her personal life in interviews, she insisted she had no such life. And when the alleged affair was mentioned, she often replied along the line of this reply that was given in one of the many interviews she gave following her release from prison. And I quote her, "You should understand, in Jenin there is neither time nor space for fun, for going out. There is neither space nor time for life. When you are in Jenin, you don't think of love. Jenin wallows in poverty, in survival, in war, in struggle. When you are there, you cannot but think of death. In Jenin, love is a luxury. Who has the time for love?" So, Jenin appears here as a site of no life, let alone individual and personal life with their connotations of sex or love. It is a site of death, and death which is completely saturated with its political meaning. It is the death of those who lost their life in their struggle for independence. On her side, Fahima appeared as her own political cause, and her body became the materialization of that cause, either as a buffer between Israeli bombs and Israeli, or as an incarnation of what we may be able to call peace, a coexistence between Israel and Palestine, Israeli and Fahima. So I'm going to propose here a different reading of Fahima's story, one that does not lend itself to the separation of the political and the personal. But I want to linger for 1 second with this understanding of this effort of, let's call it depersonalization, in order to think of it as a counter-response to the attempt to depoliticize Fahima's act by naturalizing it within the domain of sex, or personalizing it within the domain of love, and the quotation mark here are really important for me. So perhaps we can say that Fahima's insistence to appear as a purely political agent attests that she could not see that her own political act refuses the language by which these distinctions are made, as I'm going to claim in a few seconds. But perhaps she had her strategic reasons. Perhaps she understood that if she appears as a woman, if she appears as a desiring being, she risks certain political credibility. And indeed, in recent years, we have many different accounts that describe precisely such a practice, or such a dynamic in which ascribing sexual motivations to women's political actions serve to undermine these actions, marginalize them, sometimes turning them against themselves. Either way, this depersonalization did not work. The alleged affair distorted Fahima's act to the degree that its political meaning completely drained out. It became all about love, or perhaps all about sex. Fahima was called a whore, a drunk, a slut, and above all, she was accused of having a perverted sexual orientation. She prefers to have sex with Arabs. And there is actually such a curse in Israel, often hurled at female left activists, which is something like Arab's whore, or more accurately translated, it's a noun that collapses into itself the phrase, the one who prefers to fuck. So this one noun. So the one who prefers to fuck Arabs. So it was as if the sexual prohibition was recruited to charge the rationale of racial segregation and charge it with a potency only sexual taboos can convey. During one of her investigations, her interrogator brought her a gift, and I quote her describing the situation. I thought this is chocolate, and I unwrapped it, but it was a pregnancy test. He, the interrogator, asked whether I intend to call my child Muhammad, and whether he will be a little terrorist. Why a little terrorist? Fahima eventually caved into this invasive and excessive overinterpretation of her political action. He will be a big one, she said. Now, I think we could spend an entire talk just on this claim, and what it does and what it undoes, on the paradoxes that it contains. But for now, I want to take from it only one question. Living in Jenin with Israeli, Tali Fahima tried to demonstrate that not all Palestinians, not even all Palestinian fighters, aspire to kill Israelis. But through the alleged sexual relation, her body was taken to prove that they all want to bring to the end of the Jewish state, albeit in a different manner. Her fictively pregnant body came to encapsulate within it a combination of all the threats the Palestinians are taking to pose in Israeli eyes. A demographic threat, the threat of terror, the unwanted penetration to the Israeli borders, and the related, all too familiar over-sexualization of fear and the over-sexness of the racialized other. Is it possible then that a set of gender positions, or a set of positions within gender, condition the very possibility of being heard and thus being able to act within this political field, or within any political field? Can one be heard, and heard only in certain ways, even despite one's own voice or one's own words, only in manners that these specific positions circumscribe? And what happens when one is heard so differently from one what says? Because even if one strategically adopts a position that sets the ground from which one's voice can be heard, this position can never be fully controlled by the individual. Therefore, what it voices may diverge from, even counter, one's own intentions. Okay. So I will conclude here my pessimistic reading. This would be my pessimistic reading. How a certain traditional or certain traditional position within gender, traditional gender position, serves to mold a political act into seemingly or presumably non-political patterns, and thereby turning this action against itself. But now I want to find the 2 minutes I have to propose a more complex reading. First of all, I don't think we can talk here about a failure. I think the shock that Fahima arose in Israel attests to the degree to which it challenged a lot of what is assumed as a given within the Jewish Israeli identity, and question a lot of what goes uncontested. manifested within Israeli foreign and internal policy. Moreover, I'm not sure we can talk here about depoliticization or about traditional gender roles. After all, we are talking about a certain sexual deviation. Having sex with the wrong person, I keep needing these, can be read as an act of pushing against social boundaries, defeating or troubling or challenging social and political obstructions. Fahima's intended fetus does not have to be a terrorist after all. It can be the proof of the possibility of the product of a true coexistence. And perhaps more accurately, it may be called a terrorist precisely because it surfaces this option that is completely inconceivable by most Israelis, and I assume by many Palestinians as well. Moving to Palestine, being the lover of a Palestinian, or simply being a friend of a Palestinian, Fahima challenged the demarcation of the we, which is arguably the most radical political act. Even if just for one moment, she was able to forge or at least imagine, allowing us to imagine new political communities, new possible alliances. And in this mode of action, in which the personal is that which becomes the political, but in a bit of a different way than the familiar slogan of feminism, she also challenged the very demarcation of political action, and specifically the very possibility of parting the personal and the political. Her body itself, a site of movement, a site of desire, a site of ethnic and racial demarcations, became the site of resistance. Moving back and forth between Tel Aviv and Jenin, it challenged the regime of separation between Israelis and Palestinians. Maintaining a close proximity to the enemy, it challenged the idea that every such proximity always results in death, either the death of Palestinians following encounters with Israeli soldiers, or the death of Israelis following encounters with terrorists. And, though I didn't speak about it here, as a left activist from a low-income family and of a North African descent, Fahima also entered a political arena which is usually inhabited by upper to middle-class Ashkenazi Jews of European descent. So I cannot determine between these two readings here, and I doubt that anyone can. Hannah Arendt once said that the full meaning, and I quote her, of any political story can reveal itself only when it has ended. But when does a political story end? And who is its legitimate teller? And if these questions don't have an answer, and I maintain they rarely have, then we have to allow these different stories, these different readings, to be together, to share the messy spaces of our articles like they share the messy space of politics.
Thank you, Dr. Kotet. And now for our final speaker, Jack Halberstam, just about to begin a mini residency at Georgetown, George Washington rather, University, which thankfully brought him to our coast. Jack Halberstam, a leading voice in gender theory and queer studies, is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. Halberstam is the author of numerous books, including Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, and most recently, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal. Dr. Halberstam's research interests include the formation of masculinity in women, the relationship between race and masculinity, queer subcultures, and the production of places in which queer people interact and create new conceptions of queerness. A popular lecturer, Halberstam has given talks on topics such as queer failure, sex and media, subcultures, visual culture, gender variance, popular film, and animation. Halberstam is currently working on several projects, including a book on fascism and homosexuality. So I present Jack Halberstam.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to my co-panelists for those incredibly provocative talks, which I'll try to draw from a little bit in my more frivolous remarks.
And I guess a couple of things just seem to me to be really worthy of further discussion today. First, Ashwini's idea that feminism can't afford to build its projects around seemingly innocent subjects seems absolutely crucial in an age where, particularly living in the US, we're all complicit in all kinds of projects all the time. And that sort of moral high ground that feminism often takes is something that we just can't afford to be in that space. And so it was great then to hear Hagar's paper about the messy politics of territories that are riven with all kinds of different conflicts, where you can't really parse out very clear political positions that require, therefore, a different kind of epistemology, different methodologies, and so on. And I think that what we've heard already today is a topic that I'll try to address in some of my remarks, which is that feminism is at something of an impasse. It's not entirely clear to us in conflicts around the world what we mean by a feminist subject, or what the goal of feminism should be, or whether feminism, going back to some of Spivak's early work, is complicit with colonial projects or is the opposition to colonial projects. And that suggests not that simply that feminism is at fault, but that the subject positions that feminism has charted or has been built upon have clearly become scrambled rather recently, possibly, and we haven't clearly sorted out what those subject positions are now, okay? So there's a kind of Foucauldian history of the present that is required right now to make sense of categories like male, female, man, woman, and say what we mean by those categories in all kinds of different places. So what I call Gaga feminism is literally like, instead of girls gone wild, it's feminism gone wild. It's like, a feminism for a moment where gender no longer can be presumed, either in terms of its embodiment, nor in terms of its politics. So new politics need to emerge. And I'm just going to give you a few markers for what this politics of uncertainty or hesitation might look like. Many of which are drawn from the US, and that's partly to problematize the idea that this is a place of epistemological certainty and stability, and in fact to say that the real crisis is in the US, and that crisis plays out in all kinds of different ways in relationship to some of the politics that we've already heard about. So there's just Gaga feminism, should you be interested. All right, little advertising. Okay, so there are a few images that we might use to start thinking about, well, what's so different about this moment, what's different in the world that we live in. And the first one that maybe grabs our attention would be something like the pregnant man. And I'm sure you all remember the pregnant man from the Oprah show a couple of years ago, where Oprah was having an uncharacteristic lull in ratings. And so she found what is kind of the daytime talk show equivalent of a moonwalk, a pregnant man, to come on her show and take questions. Now, Thomas Beatty's claim was that he was the first pregnant man, and I immediately want to just dispense with that idea. There are lots of transgender men who over the years have held on to their reproductive bits while transitioning, and maybe on account of their partners but not being able to get pregnant, have carried babies. So the firstness of Thomas Beatty is irrelevant. What is interesting is how much of a media storm this image provoked, and how many people were intrigued and invested in this image of the pregnant man. Now, in Gaga feminism, I don't have much interest in Thomas Beatty himself. I don't really have anything to tell you about Thomas Beatty. I'm not particularly interested in him as a person or in his biography. What I am interested in is the unintended use of and consequence of very interventionist IVF technologies that have produced a new reproductive realm that is completely different than the reproductive realm that was maybe imagined by the people who first developed test tube babies and IVF technologies some 30, 35 years ago. And I think it was last year that one of the guys who invented the technology for test tube babies received a Nobel Prize. So we've sort of come to this moment where we recognize IVF as completely a part of the landscape that we live in, but we have not accounted for the massive changes in the impact that IVF has had, not simply on reproduction, but on all of these other subject positions that hinge upon certain reproductive politics. So I want to re-sketch this territory in terms of the image of the pregnant man. Now there is somebody who, back in, oh, there was another pregnant man, just in case you didn't believe me, that the transgender men have been pregnant for at least a decade. There was a feminist who died earlier this year, Shulamith Firestone, was a Marxist feminist who, I think it was in 1970, wrote a book very much along the lines of Marx's prediction of a coming revolution. And remember, Marx said that whoever controls the means of production therefore controls certain forms of power. So Shulamith Firestone comes along and she says, well, if there was a change in terms of the control of the means of reproduction, there would be the possibility of a feminist revolution. And that feminist revolution would come when we sever women from their seemingly biological destiny to carry babies. And she says, be warned, this day will come. Now, it's sort of amazing that Shulamith Firestone wrote this book some 42 years ago, and I don't believe that anyone noticed that the revolution she predicted came and went, okay? So what if you predict a revolution, it occurs, and nobody notices, okay? And that's kind of unfortunately, the tragedy of the intellectual is that, especially if you're way ahead of the curve and you predict something, everyone forgets you predicted it, and there you have it. In fact, Shulamith Firestone went in and out of insane asylums for the course of the second part of her life, and wrote a memoir about that, and was seen, really as a sort of tragic Cassandra-like figure who was like saying to us, we have the technology's being developed. What will this mean when women no longer carry the burden of childbirth? Surely there will be a complete transformation in the meaning of gender within that era. And there she is, and there's the book, and it was a very rigorous book, by the way, and I encourage people to go back and look at it, really following a kind of scientific Marxism with a very linear temporal trajectory that, as with Marx's predictions, didn't come to pass in exactly the time frame that she imagined, but nonetheless have come about. So this is what she says in The Dialectic of Sex. The end goal of feminist revolution. Oh, we lost it. Okay. The end goal of feminist revolution, she says, are we going to go back to it? Okay, I can read it here. Basically, she says the end goal of feminist revolution has to be getting rid of genital distinction itself. Okay? And I will. Not only the elimination of economic class privilege, but of the economic class distinction itself. That's the goal of socialist revolution. So the end goal of feminist revolution must be, unlike that of the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. Okay? The reproduction of the species by one sex for the reproduction of the species by one sex for the benefit of both would be replaced by at least the option for artificial reproduction. Children would be born to both sexes equally or independently of either, however one chooses to look at it. The dependence of the child on the mother would give way to a greatly shortened dependence on a small group of others in general, and any remaining inferiority to adults in physical strength would be compensated for culturally. The division of labor would be ended by the elimination of labor altogether through cybernetics. That's a nice idea, still coming. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken. And it's that last line that really resonates for me, because actually we're living in an era where the tyranny of the biological family has been broken, with all kinds of social effects and impact that we still have yet to account for. Okay, and I'm going to give you, just for the last part of my presentation, I want to give you a sense of what this new scenario looks like. Now, let's just take one of the basic ideas in Gaga feminism is that it is a big mistake intellectually to parse out different sections of the society and figure out what happens to them completely individually. And so you hear in the presentations that we've already heard, one has to bring queer theory into any accounting for notions of maturation or temporality, right? We've heard that queerness sort of has to be entwined with feminism in order to make sense of the new social landscapes that we inhabit. So to the extent that we live in an era where there's unprecedented visibility of transgender bodies, and I gave you the example of the pregnant man, we are entitled, I think, in that era to ask the question of what is heterosexuality when you have new visibility for queer bodies. It's impossible for heterosexuality not to be impacted by these new models of temporality, by these new understandings of embodiment, and by new subject positions marked out by transgender people themselves. So if there are a lot of transgender men around, okay, just as an example, and lots of heterosexual women who think of themselves as oriented to male bodies, date transgender men, right? What is the meaning of heterosexuality? Do you see? So it's not just about looking at the transgender body here, the pregnant male body, it's also about thinking about the subject position of everyone located in relationship to those bodies. So that's why I'm trying to argue that there's a kind of scrambling of social identities that we have used as the basis for social movements, and that scrambling therefore requires new forms of politics. And there are a lot of people in transgender studies who have said just this, and the person who comes to mind is someone like Dean Spade, who, rather than going to the work of psychoanalysis or to Judith Butler's early work on recognition, he goes to the work of James C. Scott, who is a political theorist who thinks deeply about the ways in which control is maintained over populations within what we call modernity. And Dean Spade uses James Scott's work to ask the question, not how do we change our gender on all of the documentation that's available to us, a driver's license or a passport. No, Spade asks a kind of Scottian question. He says, why does the DMV need to know your gender? That's a different question, a different relationship to biopower, a different understanding of the relationship of transgenderism to questions of surveillance. And it positions transgenderism not as a social identity requiring recognition from the state, but as a vantage point for thinking about new modes of surveillance and control that come with the era of biopower. So rather than seeing transgender issues as something over there, as being rights issues for another group of people, we have to place them in the middle of all kinds of political projects that are trying to understand new forms of control. Okay, so that's the kind of argument that I'm making for a Gaga feminism, along with people like Dean Spade. Okay, so that takes care of one piece of this new social landscape. Okay, we have transgender visibility. That transgenderism is coming with a different set of demands than earlier social movements came with. What happens in the realm that we call the normal, or in relationship to heterosexuality? If that cannot possibly be untouched by these other developments, how do we see the markers of change? And I'm just going to give you again some of the symptoms of crisis in the realm of what we call heteronormativity. For the first time in history, and this seems to me to be a profoundly feminist issue, divorce is the norm. So if you are committed to norms, and you believe in norms, and you want to script a life according to norms, the new norm is not marriage. The new norm is divorce, okay? The new norm for women of the age of 45 is living alone, not living with a partner. There are all kinds, the new norm for being a child, growing up in a family, is that you grow up in several families, not that you grow up in one family, okay? So to the extent that one is committed to something called the normal, one no longer is committed to the nuclear family. Now this produces all kinds of anxiety in the media, and lots of discourses about putting broken families back together again, and so on. And even that moral discourse of the broken family seems to me to be utterly inadequate, given that for many children, the fact that they can switch family homes is a source of comfort rather than oppression, because we all know about the problems of being stuck with two very dysfunctional adults who don't like each other, okay? Think about divorce as giving children an exit point, so that at least they can go back and forth between two households of fucked up adults, rather than always being stuck with the same two messed up adults, right? So divorce, rather than being, a symptom of the collapse and the breakdown of society as we know it, divorce heralds, like the transgender man, divorce is a new sort of clarion call to different social arrangements that produce different understandings of community and so on. So I want to sort of make an argument for divorce, if you like. See divorce as the proper outcome of marriage in an era of great mobility, flexibility, and longevity. What are the possibilities that two people nowadays would meet at the age of 21 and stay together till they're, not till they're 60, 65 anymore, right? We live a lot longer, till you're in your 90s, right? So if you step up to the altar nowadays and the priest says to you, or the rabbi, or whoever says to you, till death do you part, which might be 75 years from now, you know, few people are signing on to that project. So we're trying to figure out what is the meaning of marriage in an era of increased lifespans, increased mobility, globalization, and so on. And it turns out that marriage is very ill-suited to this new world that we live in. Therefore, there are massive shifts and changes in the social arrangements, kinship groups, and community forms that people subsist in, exist in, and set up new forms of relation within, okay? At this moment that marriage seems to be petering out as an institution that, of any kind of legitimacy, guess what? Suddenly, gay people want to be married. And this is a little bit like a club losing members rapidly over a short period, and then looking around in a new membership drive and saying, how about you guys? We didn't want to take you before, but we'll take you now because we really need the revenue. That's basically the message behind gay marriage. At this point in time, there is no reason to think that gay marriage will not pass across the country. The recent Democratic Convention was about Obama saying the gays, you know, addressing the gays, and this sort of saccharine narrative about loving who you want to love and so on is making the rounds. So it's at this moment that we should be asking big questions about why gays and lesbians, who, by the way, have produced all kinds of different modes of intimacy and kinship, want state recognition for normative arrangements that they have previously eschewed. Okay? And I will strenuously and repeatedly make the argument against gay marriage, precisely because this moment doesn't call for marriage, it calls for much bigger experiments in terms of connection, intimacy, and community, as I've been saying. Okay, what do some of those new arrangements look like? So I'm not just conjuring up some utopia. There are lots and lots of queer families, and queer for me doesn't simply mean two women or two men living together. Queer families might mean an extended household that includes friends as well as extended relatives who share benefits, who share healthcare options, who try to figure out how to sustain life separately from what Schulman and Firestone call the tyranny of the biological family. So one of the big arguments for approving gay marriage is that people need access to their partner's health benefits. So the argument against that is simply, your health benefits should have nothing to do with your marital status. We should always be arguing for health benefits separate from marital status. We in fact should be arguing that we should have the option to add as many people as we like to our health plan, right? So if the guy in the office next to me has 5 kids by 5 different women and can enroll all of them, why can't I enroll the woman who lives next door to me and doesn't have health care right now? Or the homeless guy who comes and takes my recycling? Why can't I put them on my health insurance? My relationship to them might be better than the guy next door's relationship to his kids. After all, why value biological connection in the age of IVF and twiddlings and sperm banks and so on? Biological connection is not at all the way in which people have kinship and intimacy. If that's not the case any longer, then certainly what becomes apparent are all kinds of new ways of making community that might be much stronger bonds, might make for a better society in the end, and might actually advocate for certain forms of redistribution of resources and wealth and cooperation that might answer some of the questions produced by this particular economic crisis that we're in. So queer families thinking about both queer economic practices, queer social practices, as well as queer intimate practices are one way of approaching that is not simply utopian, but is actually already here among us. And that's just to say the real baby boom has been among lesbians, and now lesbians are being held up as the ideal family, which is another kind of problem, right? So they found out that no lesbian homes contain sexual abuse, and lesbian moms produce much better adjusted kids than anyone, which of course is great, and you know, we should all be applauding this, but we also want to move away from simply a new form of domestic monogamy, now still attributing domestic labor to women, except for instead of one woman as your mother, you get two. You get a bonus mom along with your mom, which is part of the appeal, I think, of the lesbian mom. We should be looking beyond that nuclearity to see, as I'm saying, these wonderful experiments and different kinds of arrangements, the gaga-ness of the family in the age of IVF. And I am trying to wind down. There's a lot of genderqueer parenting out there that gives children different messages about the meaning of masculinity and femininity. That's just a very famous Kathy Opie photograph of her breastfeeding her son while still very much in a butch embodiment. The category of father, which has been sort of left untouched by the new popularity of lesbian parenting, has to be also deconstructed by having non-male bodies occupy the role of father. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm referring to as genderqueer parenting. And obviously I'm moving kind of quickly here. So I think that we are seeing the end of normal. We're in a different kind of moment, a moment that is much better served, I argue in the book, by new forms of anarchism than by any return to a sort of lefty socialist politics. There's a scrambling, as I said, of certain forms of social relations. There's an unknowing quality in our relationship to those new forms of community. And there's a desire not to have our kinship and intimacy, our community formations regulated by the state. So for me, feminism has much more nowadays to do with the Occupy movements than it has to do with bra burning. It is no longer directed at women, because women as a category no longer exists in the way that it might have existed for earlier generations of feminists. And it has to have a much broader agenda, the kind of agendas that we've already heard about on this panel, that are about understanding the new forms of gender and sexuality that are not productive of a new normal, but are actually re-scripting life as we know it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions for this great panel assembled here. I just, for a time check, how late can we go till?
We have 10 minutes, but if we can stay a little bit longer, maybe 15.
To a quarter hour, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe speak 20 minutes. Okay, so there is a microphone getting passed around if you have a question or a comment.
Hi, I'm Juliana. I just have a quick question. This kind of can go to anyone really. I just found myself being asked a lot what feminism is by people who aren't in the Women and Gender Studies department. And it's just very difficult to answer, so I always try to give kind of a broad definition. It's always changing, it's something you can't really categorize. That's the whole point of it, it's a different lens, but it still doesn't really ever seem to get across, the message doesn't get across, it's just kind of dismissed at that point, and it's frustrating for me because I can't define it. Just because I'm interested in all the different perspectives, what would your response be to such a broad and kind of overwhelming sometimes question? Check.
Well, you know, when I teach intro to women's studies, because it's focused on sort of analytic categories, I usually begin with questions of power and hierarchy and talk about feminism as being a struggle against hierarchical relations between genders as they're defined, because that's how I used to teach it. But I find increasingly that I have a much broader sort of message associated with feminism, which is a life that is free from fear. Because I think that in many dimensions of feminist activism, you find that what is being called for is a particular kind of struggle against living with fear, whether we're talking about politics related to violence or, various forms of regulation and disciplining, whether we're talking about more intimate kinds of understandings of relationships. So I mean, it sounds vague, but I think there's something about the potency of the emotion fear that makes a lot of sense to me in the context of feminist struggles.
I mean, I think that's it's a really good question for this panel, and you've heard three really different uses, not of feminism so much as a sort of feminist methodology or epistemology, or using feminism to unpack some issues that are otherwise intractable. And so I think that feminism is a mode of analysis. It often in the university has been used as a mode of analysis that takes gender very clearly into consideration when other forms of analysis do not. So there are a lot of, for example, there are so many commentaries on the Israel-Palestinian conflict that don't reflect upon gender, or that, in an uncritical way, see Israel as marked by modernity precisely because of its relationship, say, to gays and lesbians, who are often encouraged to be reproductive citizens in Israel, and then are easily able, in a colonial framework, to mark Palestinians as somehow pre-modern, right? So that kind of analysis is lost if you don't have something like feminism in the mix to make sense of the ways in which gendered bodies move differently through different spaces within different political regimes. So I don't think we're at a point where we can get rid of feminism, but I don't think any longer that anyone is under any illusion that feminism is supposed to be an identity politics addressed at women. That's clearly not what you've heard on this panel, for example.
And I think we can see a move, right? It's a historical answer, right? It's a historical question. There was a point in which feminism was about power relations that had to do with women, and then with gender, and then with sexuality. But I think after the history of the discipline, or the field, if we could call it so, then we've developed these analytical frames that can be taken to think about other issues and other topics. And when I work, for example, part of what I try to do is to take these categories and take these analytical frames and take these different deployments of gender in women's activism in order to think not about what it does to women or to gender categories or to sexual hierarchies, but what it does to the very mechanisms of justifying the Israeli occupation. So it's no longer just about women's positions or gender categories, but how do we use them to understand something else?
Several questions in the back. Keep your hands up. Okay.
Hi. I was wondering, my question is for Hagar Katef. I was wondering if I'm assuming you discussed this topic also in front of other audiences, and like you said, the response in Israel to Talit Rahima's act was very aggressive, and I was wondering what the response is towards you when you discuss this in front of audiences that are Israeli or Jewish American or Palestinians here or in Israel and Palestine.
Surprisingly, it's not aggressive. I don't know if it's because I've been lucky enough to mostly discuss it in progressive audience, or because people are scared. There's sometimes moments in which people ask me, how can I not be critical? Like this story, which I talk to very positively as a story of possible affairs, of possible sex, possible relationship, is also a story about a man who almost directly killed, I don't have the exact number, but we're talking dozens of people. And so how come one of the semi-aggressive responses, how come I don't take these lives that were lost into account in my story? And I guess partly my response to that is that being an Israeli, being part of the occupying power, the only type of critique I feel I can voice is the critique of the Israeli side. It's not that I think that violence is not justified when it is deployed by Israel, and it is justified when it is deployed as part of Palestinian resistance to the Israeli occupation, but I feel I am not in any position to talk about that violence in any way that would be just, I don't know if it satisfies those addresses.
Thank you. My name is White, at the University of Maryland. I have another question for you about where you ended up with respect to her, Tali's subjectivity as a working class, dark-skinned woman, because I think the discussion about Israel and Palestine often does not include the very important ways in which the Israeli society is raised in class, and a huge amount of poverty. And I would like you to extend your analysis and hear where you're going with whether you're using gender around what you've given us today, but then also incorporate the way that racism is functioning as well as classism in this sort of dispute that we're talking about.
I think in her case it's interesting because on the one hand, I think it's her North African descent allowed her to do things that an Ashkenazi Jew won't be able to do. And she talks a lot about how Arabic used to be a language spoken by her parents and then silenced at some point. And how this journey, which is really, it's a political journey, but it's also a personal journey back to her own roots, back to her Arab roots, basically, allowed her, oh, I lost my sentence, but how these roots allowed her to make this journey into a journey of reclaiming identity and making a new possible identity within the Israeli-Palestinian community. But on the other side, I think it's precisely it is precisely this origin that made her much more vulnerable to these aggressive reactions to her act. I think had she been more white and more rich, she could do things differently. And I think the end of the story, which I haven't got to hear, proves it most clearly. Fahima lost her job. She had a job at a law office as kind of an administrative person. She lost her job after that. She could never find another job. She was unable to support herself. Her mom and family was unable to support her. She moved to live in a Palestinian village within the border of Israel because this was the only community that was willing to accept her. Because she came from a community, this is another layer of analysis to the racial stratification of Israel. She came from a community that being poor and being of an Arab descent is also much more right-wing than other communities in Israel. So they rejected her more than everyone else. And so she had no place to be. And a lot of the way her story is told in Israel is a story about a woman who completely lost her mind in the process of trying to find a new home in a new community. And this is undoubtedly part of the story that should be told, but I think that also these different layers of possible identities allow us to tell the story very differently.
Hi. I'm wondering if the panelists can talk about their ideas in terms of labor laws. Particularly, the first speaker talked about sexual maturation, and I'm wondering if you have any comments about the child labor laws that were taking place around the end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century, and how that juxtaposes, with what you're saying. And then the third speaker, I love the Gaga family. I've never heard of that before. It's fantastic. But I'm wondering about how this scrambling effect of the family, how that is intersected also with labor. Easy example is the recession and the need for not just dual earner families, but triple, quadruple earner families to get by, and having extended families move in with each other, neighbors, all these changes with labor, and then to go along with the idea of labor laws, we would need reform in labor laws to match or to catch up with our demographic shifts and all these shifts in families. So if you could speak about that.
Sure, great question, thank you. I did mention, I think, at the beginning that it was the discrepancies between laws on marriage, rape, and prostitution and child labor that led me to sort of think more carefully about how the child was being defined. Well, specifically when it came to child labor laws, the child was defined as much younger. So, you know, child labor laws typically, I mean, they've shifted obviously over the course of the 20th century, but at the moments that I was studying in the 20s and 30s, the end of childhood was, you know, in response to what was the social reality, was marked as being around 12 and then 14 and then 16, at some point it was 15. So what does this tell us? I mean, it speaks to the problem of economic insecurity, the fact that many families had to send their children out to work, and children played different roles in their households and assumed responsibilities much younger. So it wouldn't have made sense to have childhood defined as ending at 18 or 21. And yet, when it came to marriage or sexual consent, all of a sudden, you know, it was marked as happening much later. The other point that you asked, I mean, I think, well, I guess the issue here is, you know, labor laws should be reformed. So I don't want to have my presentation read as a kind of apology for child labor, obviously. But really the question is, you know, what is the process of universalizing age standards about? Why are age-based markers so important? How is that a part of a particular kind of biopolitics that has emerged in the 20th century? Can we imagine a conversation about power and its abuses without a reliance on age-based markers? Right? Because really the problem is about abuses of power, right? It's about particular kinds of vulnerability, and I mean particular kinds of fear, to just go back to what I said. You know, so how might we actually sort of detach ourselves from a reliance on those numbers as somehow being inherently sort of meaningful? Because I think it's the case that if you just look at any number of contexts, not just you know, beyond the United States, even within the United States, I mean, we can recognize that being 14 means something different depending on your class, gender, racial location. So really, you know, shouldn't we be talking about that, you know, what exactly those vulnerabilities are, instead of saying, well, no, sorry, you know, at 13, you know, you can babysit. No.
Yeah, it's a great question, because you know, I was giving this sort of optimistic view of this demographic shift, but you know, as I say in the book, there are a lot of other factors that underscore this shift and what its meaning is going to be across different race and class groups. And so the recession, for example, has in fact resulted in the underemployment of men across class and across different ethnic groups, and women have been less likely to lose their employment because they've been mostly in the service industry, and most of the unemployment has been in relationship to industrial jobs and so on. So there are a lot of different shifts within the labor market that have also completely shifted the meaning of male and female, masculine and feminine. That said, there was a report on the radio the other day that underscored something that we kind of probably already know, which is most people living in poverty in the US are women, single women with children. So what was the radio report suggesting was the answer? How do those women get married? Marriage is offered as a solution to single women with kids living in poverty, even though there's a recognition that particularly within the working class, men are unemployed, right? So this is just a ridiculous way of offering as a solution what has often been the problem in the first place. So, you know, back in the 1930s, a family wage was tethered to the male wage in the presumption that he would be the head of household, producing women as a dependent class, basically. And so now labor laws have to come back around and recognize that if most people living in poverty today are single women with children, then we should be paying much higher wages, in fact, to single women in order to compensate for the fact that single women have taken on a much higher burden of childcare than any other group in the society. So if you were to take seriously the fact that there is a complete scrambling of the family, of social relations, of even the meaning of male and female, one would have to rescript all kinds of different policy according to that. But because policy is often written within a moral framework in this country, as opposed to a pragmatic one, we end up offering marriage counseling to women who actually need instead some sort of subsidy to compensate them for the unfair burden of raising children in an era that is now post-welfare, right?
Okay, so I've been told that we have to break for lunch very soon. I think we have time for one more question.
I think Jared will have the last question.
I don't know if this might be a little too frivolous for the last question, but this is for Professor Halberstam. So I wanted your thoughts about gay marriage and kind of the normalization of the gay family brought about a very frivolous subject for me. So I'm thinking about America's kind of current family, the Honey Boo Boo family. I don't know how familiar folks are here with Honey Boo Boo.
I keep hearing it, but I usually am on top of these things, but I actually don't know the Honey Boo Boo thing.
Okay, so Here Comes Honey Boo Boo is a spin-off from Toddlers and Tiaras. It's about a kind of poor white family in Georgia whose youngest daughter does like toddler pageants, toddler beauty pageants. And
Is it a sitcom? Or?
Yeah, it's a reality show.
Oh.
Okay, yeah.
I gotta watch it.
Yeah, it's quite incredible actually. The family makeup is of Mama Bear, Sugar Bear, who is the biological father of one of the children, and then there's 4 or 5 children total and a grandchild involved.
Sugar Bear.
Sugar Bear, yeah, and their names like Honey Boo Boo, Chickadee, things like that. And so I'm just thinking about how this kind of poor white family became much more queer than the mainstream gay movement, the kind of human rights campaign, the Born This Way, you're either gay or straight kind of movement. And even in the season finale, they get a visit from their uncle, who they call Uncle Poodle, who is Sugar Bear's brother, who is a flamboyantly gay man, and Honey Boo Boo, this 4-year-old who does beauty pageants, says.
I love this question so far.
Honey Boo Boo, who's this 4-year-old beauty pageant contestant, says everyone's got a little gay in them, which is so much more queer than this Born This Way kind of ideologies, and that's kind of coming from that kind of background that is kind of becoming more normative with the divorced parents, the step parents, ex-step parents, marriage, divorce, kind of, my 17-year-old brother living with his 17-year-old girlfriend in our house, that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering, how did like the people who are supposed to hate like the gay people, the elites, and all that become more queer than the gay intellectual kind of movement, us kind of people basically, who are re-embracing marriage, who are re-embracing the nuclear family, and how do we kind of use this kind of new movement amongst the more common people, I guess, if you want to use a very patronizing term. How do we use this moment to kind of turn back that normalization of us, I guess,
I have no idea. Thank you for explaining Honey Boo or Honey Boo Boo?
Honey Boo Boo.
Honey Boo Boo. I was watching Bill Maher last night, and he was doing a little funny piece about how, he was taking seriously the fact that there were some protests in Syria saying, sort of people holding up signs saying not all Syrians are anti-American, and he was like. Then he did a little skit where he had people supposedly holding up signs saying things like "Call me maybe," from Syria, and "Honey Boo Boo." So I'm like, okay, now I have a context for this to kind of say, oh, it's great that the world is coming back around and loving the U.S. And of course, U.S. culture becomes this universal vector, and so that's why it's so important, in fact, to take U.S. popular culture seriously, because it doesn't stay here. It becomes a kind of lingua franca for all kinds of different discussions worldwide. But I think you've said it best. I mean, you're clearly a gaga feminist, so I'm going to give way to you on this one. Clearly, there is sort of popular wisdom about the breakdown of the family and its reconfiguration in a much queerer form that is lost on people who see only legal recognition as the only way to achieve something like political justice. That's not at all what early queer social justice movements had in mind with gay liberation fronts. People were not trying to come into a sort of bourgeois system and get recognition within it. People were trying to transform the society as we know it. And maybe that's not happening in the HRC, but apparently it is happening in Honey Boo Boo families all over the country. So to be continued.
On such short notice to come and join us in the celebration. And thank you to the audience for coming out on a Saturday morning. I'm sure none of you regret it. All right, and I hope you all stay for the rest of the event.